He's the star, Richard Mazzy, Schultzford.com. I am Bubba from 100.7 Star, and our star joining us today is Professor Greg Jackson. Welcome to Cars, Stars, and Everything in Between. You're the creator and the host of the top podcast, History That Doesn't Suck.
That is right.
I just think, and we were just talking about this, why as you get older, history really becomes more relevant to you. You take it for granted as a child in high school, college. I think you take things for granted. It's just like, here we are. But as we get older, I think we start to really appreciate how we got where we are. And I wonder, when did that desire stir in you? Have you always had that feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I completely take your point. I think you're describing the path of a lot of my my listeners. I have people listening across all age groups, kids, senior citizens, but the 30s is where the bell curve is the biggest. For me, though, I remember being in high school, 10th grade, Mrs. Berry's world history class, and we were talking about Napoleon Bonaparte and him going across Europe, conquering. And, there's a bit of irony there because Napoleon's rise is thanks to the French Revolution, this idea about liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And now he's the emperor conquering the continent. But as they go, his men are talking with the men that they conquer and defeat, including the Russians. And a very long story short, French soldiers talking about liberty are planting ideas in Russian soldiers that are going to lead to turmoil and eventually the overthrow of the Tsar. It's going to go a very different direction with communism. But all these ideas are being planted and they're going to cook and simmer. And for me, I'm a teenage kid, and it never really dawned on me that, in war, sure, soldiers taken prisoner, they end up having conversations at some point with those that capture them, their people. Ideas are exchanged. And to me, that was kind of the moment where it came to life a bit.
Professor Jackson, I have a question. Obviously, when you look at history, you're looking at everything through a retrospective, right?
Yes.
But because of what you do and because of your podcast and your live show that'll be coming to Pittsburgh, do you realize in the moment when history is happening in real time?
That's the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
I think that, just like we all think of ourselves as the main character in our own lives, right? And frankly, you should be. You're living your life wrong if you're in a supporting role,
right?
But
good point.
Right. See, philosophy for you too. You're welcome.
Let's go, Professor Jackson.
Absolutely.
Dropping knowledge.
Hey, he's not called professor for no reason.
Right.
That's right. But that said, I think every generation also tends to overstate and think that basically think of themselves as being more important than perhaps they really are. And I don't mean that to blow off anything that our generation faces or that another generation faces, but that I actually find a lot of comfort in it because I can look at, maybe what our challenges are and realize, previous generations, yeah, they had their challenges too. And somehow they managed to survive, get through it, leave the world that we've inherited. And actually, it's gotten better more often than it hasn't. So for me, there's some comfort in realizing that maybe I am not as important as I might want to think I am, or that my generation isn't as important as it might want to think that it is. Is that making some sense?
It does, actually.
It does, but what determines, and what have you seen generational similarities?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because look, the technology changes, but we're the same species. We are just as brilliant, beautiful, stupid, selfish, egotistical, charitable, all those wonderful and terrible things that make up humanity. They play out again and again and again. And that's the thing that I believe is lost on people, makes them think that history does suck. And that's what I'm trying to push back against with my podcast, my live show, is bringing these characters to life, putting the story back in history, where you realize that these aren't just names and dates of some dead dudes, but rather these are people who felt fear, who were absolutely horrified at times, who felt joy, success, who had moments of great goodness in them, and moments of just, terrible failure. When all those pieces come together, it stops being names and dates, and you realize that there's something far richer and interesting and relatable to your own life.
Which do you find the most interesting? The most interesting, not necessarily your favorite, but which do you find the most interesting?
Which what?
Which part of history that you have studied?
I think the answer to that could change depending on the week, but right now I'm going to say the late 1800s, Gilded Age, in that space.
Why?
It does have a fair number of parallels to our present. It's a time of intense, rapid change. It's the second industrial revolution.
Yes.
So, you've got people who remember life, before electricity, before the telegram even. And suddenly they're living in a world where the telephone exists. And instead of it being a 6-month journey that pioneers take to cross the country, that's a train ticket. It's just wild the way that things are changed. Steaks, for instance, everything down to the way you eat. You've got a New Yorker who's now eating a steak that was, roaming the wilds of Texas only a week before, but thanks to refrigerated rail cars, well, suddenly that's a thing. So supply chains are rapidly changing. The world's just in absolute flux and turmoil, and politics are hot. The two parties are at each other's throats. I think there are a number of parallels.
There really are. How do you decide in your show what you use?
So I very intentionally move chronologically. The podcast is intended to basically be your audiobook for learning all of U.S. history. So my first episode is George Washington as a 22-year-old kid getting his face handed to him by the French in 1754. And that's the first battle that actually starts the French and Indian War. And that then spills into the Revolutionary War. So we see how George Washington, getting his hard knocks as a kid, actually cracks open the door to the eventual revolution. And I've just gone for more or less chronologically from there. Right now, I'm just wrapping up the New Deal, so I'm into FDR's era. And all along the way, though, I do try to make sure I'm grabbing engrossing stories that really bring the era to life. So whether that's telling the story of the hundreds of workers who died building the Brooklyn Bridge, or similar, building the Transcontinental Railroad. Of course, wars always have ample tales of heroism and horror. Yeah.
And you're basically, what you're doing, not basically, but you are doing, is humanizing all of these events.
Yes.
You're
yes.
showing what's underneath the text. It's all subtext.
Correct.
And that's exactly what you're doing, which makes it, when you humanize it, and it's interesting to get behind that, somebody's decision making. Wow, this is where I'm going to do this, and this is why, or these are my conflicts, these are my struggles, and you're bringing all those to light. And now the music part, how do you do that?
And we'll find out when we come back, because Professor Greg Jackson is going to be in Pittsburgh at the Carnegie Library Lecture Hall on March 31st. 100 years of American history in 100 exhilarating minutes. Find out more about that show when we come back. This is Cars, Stars, and Everything in Between with Professor Greg Jackson on 100.1 FM, AM 1020, KDKA. We'll be right back after this with that answer and more. Perfect. All right. Stand by.
Oh, okay. Who said Bob?
Stand by.
All right. Remind me what the question was. Where were we?
In the integration of music into this.
Yes. Music.
And Baba, that was the wrong date.
Oh, I just grabbed it off the email, so I'll correct it. What's the date?
Sunday, May 4th.
Okay, I'll correct that. Sorry, my fault. Someday I'll get better at my job.
We all feel the same way about ourselves.
We'll document that historically.
That's right.
I can go and do a pickup with that. No problem. All right, saving that. And here we go. What's that date one more time? Because I'll lead with that.
May 4th.
May 4th.
Sunday, May 4th.
Yep. Here we Go. All right, standing by and rolling. 100.1 FM, AM 1020 KDKA. This is Cars, Stars, and Everything in Between. He is the star, Richard Bazzi, Schultz Ford, SchultzFord.com. I'm Bubba from 100.7 Star, and our star today is Professor Greg Jackson, who is going to be in town on May 4th at the Carnegie Library Lecture Hall. This is history that doesn't suck. 100 years of American history in 100 minutes. And when we last left off, Richard, you were asking Professor Jackson about music integration into his live show.
I did, and I was asking how do you do that, and is it effective to grab your audience? Because I just think that it's music in time frames. It always interests me to see, even movie making or TV, how they integrate music, and is it always correct or not correct to use music of that era? Like, can you jump forward and use today's music on something that was 30 years ago?
Sure. Asking good questions. So first of all, yes, ample music, both in the live show and in the podcast. Some of that is composed by me. I also have a wonderful partner, Airship, that I work with, who handles my sound production. But to answer your question specifically, yeah, I do have a rather cinematic feel when I tell history, both on the stage and on the podcast. And music helps with that. Music evokes emotions. Now, I am a academic, right? I'm a tenured professor. So I come at history from a very rigorous place, but in being a storyteller as much as a academic, I understand the power of music in taking us, getting our mind into a certain place. So sometimes that means using music from the era, but sometimes that also means original compositions that simply evoke the right sense. So for instance, staccato notes are going to fill us with a sense of adrenaline rush and urgency and concern. Well, if we're in the midst of the Battle of Antietam, for instance, 1862, Civil War, we might need some heightened energy, and it's less about replicating the softer violin sounds that we might expect, and it's more about taking you into that soldier's fear and trepidation as he sits in the sunken road with bullets flying at him from every direction, literally barricaded behind the bodies of the dead and wounded, his own friends, family, that have fallen all around him.
And this music is happening as you're speaking, correct? Yes. So it adds to intensity of the moment.
Correct. Yep.
I mean, I have to be honest with you. I'm pretty blown away by this conversation. I have a couple people that actually have sent some questions in. I haven't edited any of them.
Let's do it. I love unedited. Let's fly.
I love that.
I'm a little afraid of them.
Don't be afraid, Richard. Don't be afraid.
Right. Okay. Let's lean in.
All right. How meaningful does he believe the 250th anniversary of Concord, Lexington, that just occurred is, especially going forward?
Oh, I think it's incredibly meaningful. I marked it myself with my family. John Adams, when he was writing in his journal about July 2nd, which he argues is the real national day of celebration, not July 4th. But he mentioned in there how the date, and I realize I'm talking about the 4th of July now rather than Lexington and Concord, but he noted how he hoped that this would be celebrated for 1,000 years. Just the idea of of representation, of self-governance. And to me, Lexington and Concord, I mean, that's the starting moment. Here's the thing that you got to know about that day. If there's nothing else that you remember, I mean, Paul Revere's awesome. Don't get me wrong, all that jazz. This is the first time it happens in Concord. It happens at the North Bridge. This is the first time ever, after 12 years of tense buildup between the crown and the colonies and their frustrations and almost, and spilling some blood. This is the first time that American officers, militiamen, right? The officers actually told their men, fire at the King's regulars.
Wow.
That's what makes it so special. That's why it's the quote unquote shot heard around the world, according to Emerson.
By the way, I need to clarify one thing. I'm reading a question from a text message, and I should have been smart enough to realize that the anniversary of Concord was supposed to be Concord, obviously.
Yeah, concrete. Yes.
So
yes.
aside from feeling really stupid right now,
Professor Jackson, how often does somebody tell you something about history that you don't know?
It does still occur on occasion. I mean, history, there's almost no end to it. You can
Right.
always go deeper. So I have a very vast and deep knowledge base that is very true. But if someone dedicates their life, and in fact, I really enjoy going to places like, Gettysburg, or, other historical sites where we've got national parks, people in place, because they've dedicated their lives solely to that one aspect, right? That one day of history. And they just have a depth on that one little piece of history that can only be obtained when you sink 20 to 30 years into it. So it's a real blast for me to go to this place that, yeah, I know backwards and forwards compared to 99% of people, but to be able to talk to someone else who can take me even deeper. And I'm nothing but grateful to them. I think it's important to at least attempt to be humble, to remember that I'm not a god of history. And I really like when people can teach me something.
That's awesome.
So we know that usually the present portends the past, right?
Right.
What do you see? What would you think would be something that's next for us? What do you see ahead? And do you use the past to come up with that idea?
Prognostication is a nasty business that historians find themselves in, right? Trying to tell the future. So I'm very careful to say I'm not going to predict exactly, what 5 years out, 10 years out looks like. But one thing that I've noticed about the American people in particular, to get away from even human generalities, but our nation and the culture that we've put together in this conglomerate of people that are not any particular, ethnicity or religion. We don't know when to quit. And I say that in a good way. No matter what ugly space we might find ourselves in, be it the Great Depression with 24.9% unemployment, the death and destruction of world wars, the Civil War, there's a hopefulness that just refuses to die, that FDR sense of nothing to fear but fear itself. Even when we forget that for a moment, as I think, some perhaps are in the present, somehow when we hit rock bottom, we never stay on our backs. We tend to get back up. So I don't know what exactly, we'll look at in terms of the economy or political situations or what AI is going to do. But what I do know is that Americans are just plucky and gritty and always rise again.
Resilient.
Before I lose you, because I know we're getting short on time. I want to go back to the point of when you talked about the late 1800s and the Industrial Revolution. As a car dealer, I'm a Ford dealer, obviously. Henry Ford, really big impact on everything, right? Yeah. He created something that really was changed everybody's life.
Yep.
So I look at that and I say, well, first of all, that's a salute. Otherwise, without him, there would be no me. But it seems that regardless, that it is politicized, no matter what. For example, our industry right now is going through a very big transition. And that transition was forced on us by administration, right? Now, so that's politics. Because when you change administration, now the change takes place, and now that those same set of theorems and that same set of the future changes. So it wouldn't change, but it changes because of the politics. For example, and I'll just give you a very brief, and I'm not going one way or another on it. So we had mandates in this industry that we had to electrify X number, X percentage by X date. That was mandated. Right? Now we changed administration's mandates. But one of the things we found out by doing that, however, was the public wasn't ready to accept that. And so now we changed administrations, And now we've removed all of the mandates. They're gone. And so that is political. Now that's going to change our lives as we see it for the next 25, 50 years, probably. Right. So it's interesting for me to see where politics does enter into it, and opinions that are forced on us because we have to comply. Does that make sense?
It happens generation and generation, over and over again. I think the finest example of that would be the era right after the Civil War, and when Andy Johnson became president unexpectedly because John Wilkes Booth put a derringer to the back of Abe Lincoln's head. And, historians argue and fight about what policy would have looked like afterward. But under Andy Johnson, who he is a very complicated figure, he often gets reduced to two-dimensional takes. But nonetheless, the outcome of his presidency was killing a lot of the inertia that there was to create a more equal society that included Black Americans. And as a result, we got 100 years of Jim Crow. And it took until, as you both know, the 1960s for civil rights to happen. There are some historians who say, that really might have been nipped in the bud a century sooner if we had a different president, right? Just in 1865 and into 1868.
That's the fascinating part for me. That it could have changed everything.
The ripple effects, they're very real. And so there's no way to even know at times. The stones that we are dropping into the river right now, today, the ripple effects that we're sending on yet unborn generations, which is where it's important to have civil dialogue, to participate in the Republic, regardless of what your politics are, to make your voice known, to try and get the best policy to the forefront. Not that we're always going to get it right, but we owe it to our descendants to try.
I agree with that. Bubba, I apologize. I know I'm going to interject here real quick. We have been involved recently with somebody named Mark Fogel. Do you know who Mark is?
I am not familiar, no.
So Mark Fogel was the Russian prisoner. It was American, held in Russia for 3.5 years. And some of the stories are pretty incredible that he tells. I've become a friend of his. Oh. And he was actually featured on in the Donald Trump's State of the Union address. They introduced him.
I did watch the State of the Union. Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Forgive me. If it's happened in the last decade, I'm less up on it.
But it's interesting because his stories are just crazy, and I wonder if he even realizes to this day what part of history he plays in this.
Richard, I think this is related, but you'll enjoy the story even if I'm wrong. I love thinking about this journal entry I read of a continental soldier. He was a New Englander. He was a militiaman, and then he was told, "Hey, this body down south has decided that it's Congress and that this is now the Continental Army." So he's not very excited when this Virginian by the name of George Washington shows up in their camp in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and says, "Hey, by power of the Continental Congress, I'm now the general in command of this army." His journal entry for July 2nd, it says nothing of interest today. July 3rd, it says ditto. That's the day George Washington showed up. I think it's really fascinating, so, and this is where my mind went there as you were telling me about Mark. Here's this soldier who 250 years ago made a journal entry about how unremarkable, right? One word, ditto, the arrival of George Washington was. I doubt he would have thought that 250 years later, some historian would be reading his journal and sharing about that, on a radio, which you wouldn't even know what a radio is. I have no doubt that, whether it's Mark or so many others who've left some sort of mark on history, we have no idea of knowing the way that our stories are going to keep coming up.
But they do, and they keep repeating. And that's the part that when you started to talk initially that you said, right? They do. They are they're generational, but they're similar in so many ways.
Yes, I like the way Mark Twain put it. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. Mark Twain, the man, he was always good for a phrase.
I like that a lot.
May 4th, Professor Greg Jackson. You will be at the Carnegie Library Lecture Hall right here in Pittsburgh, right on Forbes Avenue. History that doesn't suck. Hopefully everybody can come out and see you because it is an amazing show.
Thank you so much for having me, gents.
Professor.